So it is right at noon, and I am going to go ahead and get started with the introductions. And first off, again, my name is Sarah Hipship. I am the Managing Director for Communications for the Colorado State University Research Foundation and a proud and honored collaborator of the Ask the Expert seminar series that is hosted in a collaboration between the CCTSI, venture partners at CU Boulder, and the Research Foundation at CSU, as well as funding from the NIH Research Evaluation and Commercialization Hubs, the REACH Spark program at CU Anschutz. So we are very excited to be here today hosting Pharoah Schnieber. Pharoah is a medical device executive and former FDA reviewer and a recognized expert in regulatory affairs with R&D leadership experience in medical devices and specifically cardiac devices. So she worked for many years at the FDA and has worked for over 15 years on driving and leading global regulatory submissions for Class 3 medical devices and drug device combination products. She was recently appointed COO at Boomerang Biomedical, which is the awesome background she has today. And will be talking to us about navigating medical device development and regulatory approvals and things you should be aware of as small emerging companies and innovators at any of our campuses or in the general Northern Colorado population, if that's who is joining us today. So welcome, Pharoah, and I'm glad to have you. And also for those of you in the audience, again, the Q&A is open, and at any time, feel free to submit questions there. I can also respond to you personally in chat if you feel like chatting directly to me with something that you don't want broadcast on the Q&A. So to get started today, Pharoah, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your journey and how you came to be an expert in regulatory affairs? So,
yeah, I keep getting told I'm an expert, so it must be true. So I am a biomedical engineer by training. I went and got my bachelor's and master's in biomedical engineering at Syracuse University. After my master's degree, I decided to do what every graduate does. They apply everywhere and anywhere that will take an application. And my first job out of school was actually working for FDA. At that point in time, a really, really long time ago, they didn't really teach how medical devices or drugs or biologics got on the market in engineering school. You kind of just learned it on the job. So when I applied for this job at the FDA, I didn't even know what they did. All I just saw was there was a medical device fellowship and, it's a job. So I spent the first 7 years of my career there. I was a lead and engineering reviewer of Class 3 combination products, specifically coronary drug-eluting stents. And then in 2011, I actually made the leap into industry, primarily because I, wanted to know if I could do this job on the other side of the fence, and also for other personal reasons. But I am still here. I started off at a company called Biotronic, which in the US is well known for their pacemakers and ICDs. Then I got recruited actually by a former FDA reviewer to work for Medtronic Diabetes for about a year. Didn't work out just because I got recruited out of Medtronic Diabetes to work for a company in Colorado Springs called Spectranetics. So that's how I ended up in Colorado. Spectranetics makes atherectomy devices, so devices that clear plaque from either your coronary vessels or your peripheral vasculature using laser technology. And then about 2017, Spectranetics got acquired by Philips. So the light bulb company, but they don't make light bulbs anymore. And then in 2018, I made the leap into startups, and have enjoyed it since.
So you have a wide variety of experience, right? Both in the back end of regulatory and the review side, and then in large company. And now you've gone beyond small company all the way to a startup, which is like super small company. How do you pull what you have? Well, let me start with what sort of is the difference for you in working and experiencing R&D in medical device development in a startup versus the next size company where something hopefully has been fully commercialized and you might actually have full on R&D budget.
Yep. So I think for startups, I think the adage of rolling up your sleeves is definitely true. Luckily, I don't know if it's luckily, I don't know if R&D engineers would like to say it's luckily, but a lot of R&D work, R&D testing, things that you send to FDA, things that you do for audits are dictated by the regulatory bodies. So when I took over R&D, it was really more along the lines of just helping the engineers navigate the regulatory pathway. And so you get to feel the anxiousness and the pain a bit more at a startup when you're looking at R&D and you're also leading other functions, versus I think when I worked for Spectranetics or Philips or Medtronic or Biotronic, I mean, you were part of the cross-functional team, but the anxiety that comes with starting computational modeling that takes 3 months to finish and crossing your fingers and hoping everything works out with a good factor of safety is pretty nerve-wracking. So I called a lot of my former R&D colleagues quite a bit, and thanked them for their efforts, and they just basically said I had no idea.
So what are some of the very early questions that you field that help you guide the business and deal with just getting everything in the right place so you can have a regulatory package that has even a chance of getting there?
So, I mean, I don't mean to be overly simplistic, but from my personal experience, medical device development can really be broken down into I would say 5 phases. The first and foremost, you have to be solving a problem that needs to be solved, and the active word there is need. The next question is, can you make that solution? The third question is, does your solution work? Then after that, the next question is, can you make money off of it? I know that sounds really terrible, but without making money, you can't really do anything else in an organization. And then, the next question is, how do you get it to market? And from my experience, you really have to look at all of those almost in parallel to do, medical device development well. I would say that, the VCs and the private equity firms and even the strategics that I talk to and my boss talks to, 2 of their biggest questions is, what does FDA tell you that you need to do? And then how much is, your product worth, your idea worth? How much money are we going to get? Not only just from a return on investment, but, if you're looking at a strategic, what does, your revenue projections look like? So, it really is a parallel path approach, because what you do for testing is driven by your regulatory body. You can do extra testing, especially if you're looking at an innovative product and perhaps there's no ISO standard or ASTM standard that does it. But I would say 80% of what you do or have to do for a medical device from an R&D standpoint is already pretty well established, from whether you're looking at Europe, US, or Japan.
So I obviously know you because you have been a mentor for our research to market programs, both at Colorado State University and with venture partners at CU Boulder. And I guarantee to the audience that we did not discuss this in advance, but the first thing that Pharoah just said was that, whatever the product is that you have, there must be a need for it. And that is one of the goals of the research to market programs. And I'm curious, when you think about figuring out what the need is, how do you recommend, because I'm sure there are multiple ways of figuring this out, not just doing customer discovery, but can you talk a little bit about really scoping the need so that you can then obviously figure out if you can make whatever it is that solves the need?
Yeah, I mean, I work with colleagues that are far more expert at this than I am, but the way I've seen it successfully done, I think Stanford Biodesign is pretty good about this, is you go in with a pretty open mind, and you really do have to be, for lack of a better term, less academic about the process, right? Whether or not something needs to be fixed is driven not only by your regulatory submissions, but also, are you going to make money off of it? And it becomes very complicated because people talk about, a total addressable market. That's a huge word, and it means a lot of different things. But when you look at regulatory approvals, even 510(k) clearances, products are approved for very specific indications and patient populations and usages. So when you're trying to figure out, can you make money off of your idea such that someone needs it, you have to drill all the way down to who is it actually being used for. So, it can't just be, pulling from cardiovascular. Apologize, my son is struggling with the time change. It can't just be coronary artery disease. You have to be very specific about which patient populations within coronary artery disease you're tackling, because you can't just tackle all of it at once. It's a huge trial. And even with 510(k) products, a lot of people say that, hey, it's a pretty broad label. Yes and no, right? It's a pretty broad label in the sense that guide wires are used for a myriad of different things, but, there's guide wires for cardiovascular, there's guide wires for surgical purposes. So there's a lot of different things that you have to really narrow your scope. And so the way I've seen this been very successfully done by very good cross-functional teammates is, you really have to get very granular in the domain space that you're working in. So for example, autoimmune disease, that's a pretty broad area that my company works in. So we have to narrow it down to, well, which autoimmune diseases are we looking at? We're looking at GI, we're looking at something else. Okay, we're looking at this. So then what aspect of that particular specialty are we focusing on? And then you just keep drilling down, and give yourself a couple of different options. And then you get to decide whether or not what you've picked balances out all of the other aspects of that whole product development process, such that it makes it a worthwhile idea. And I think you had a really good question in our earlier discussion is, have I ever worked on something that was amazing and such an awesome idea and it failed or didn't get funded? And then, yeah. And we actually went and talked to FDA about a product that doesn't exist for a very niche disease state. And, that was part of the evaluation on, is the juice worth the squeeze? So unfortunately, when you added everything together, it was not a problem that needed to be fixed. What was out on the market was fine. And the investment from a regulatory standpoint was just too much for it to balance out.
So that leads to a really interesting conversation about, well, at least interesting to me. And those of you who are in the audience, if it's not interesting for you, please ask another question. But we receive in the tech transfer offices, we receive technologies that in many ways have been identified as something that's missing. And so when you think about research and everything that's going into research in academia and searching the literature and finding a hole, and this development of maybe there's a need for better tubing, or there's something that is clearly missing. And then how approaching it from that perspective versus approaching it maybe more from the company perspective of, is there enough of a need that we can dedicate resources to finding an answer or a solution, but having to know where you find those needs separately when you are a small company versus just knee deep in academic literature. Do you have any suggestions or how a company goes about addressing that differently?
Well, actually, a lot of where even we started within Boomerang was in the literature, right? The idea started in the literature of how, medical devices could be used to help treat autoimmune diseases. And what you then have to do is you have to go through the process of validating it with not only, clinical trialists, right? KOLs, but also much like the R2M program, business people, right? People that sell the product, people that would reimburse this product. It's super important to be able to validate that. So that's how you start narrowing whether or not you're in the right space, right? But we always start in the literature. I think, the literature is where the forefront is published, I guess, where the next frontier is. But you do have to go through and start validating those assumptions. You start validating whether or not, there's reimbursement for it. You start validating whether or not, how much is it going to cost, right, to make this product? How much money are you anticipating that you should be getting back once the product's on the market? And then on top of that, you get a pretty good idea if you've got, good regulatory folks on the team or access to good regulatory folks, how long it will take for you to get on the market, because that drives how much money you're going to make. If it's going to take you an entire decade or longer to get something on the market, then you have to start asking yourself whether or not that's a good idea. But if it's something that you can get on the market in the next, 3 to 5 years, that's something that, becomes a bit more compelling. The one thing you do have to keep in mind is, when you're working in class 3 or class 2 or class 1 medical devices, I think most people in my industry would agree that this is not, at least over the last decade, this is not a sprint. It's a marathon. The difference is just, is it a half marathon? Is it a full marathon? Or is it an ultra marathon? So you really have to be prepared to go all the way to a commercial product as an organization and not be stuck on, what do I need to do for an exit? If you get stuck with what you need to do for an exit, you probably will not know how to get the product on the market from a regulatory standpoint very well and crisply. Same thing with, when you're doing your market assessment, you may take some broader strokes, but to really do this well, and the folks that I've seen do this well at startups as well as large companies, you do have to really approach this like a company. Unfortunately, I think that's the direction that the industry is going.
So I'm thinking about that. I worked in pharma previously, and ancillarily involved in providing some of the science data that would go into regulatory applications. But there was a pretty decent amount of emphasis put forward on technique and methods and manufacturing and all of those components that I know for pharmaceuticals have to be listed, and that you can't change later on once it's approved, with some exceptions. And I do not know if that is the same for medical devices. When I think about, right, creating tubing, and tubing is one of those things that we often get coatings, updated coatings for tubing and various catheter type and new material design. How much does the manufacturing process build into a medical device application? Because going from a scaled academic lab to a commercial scalable concept, you do have to write down the methods.
Yep. Well, and the pharma is pretty big into, design for manufacturing. And I think the larger corporations like a Medtronic and Boston Scientific and an Abbott can afford that, because they have the dollars to increase the velocity when it comes to manufacturing process development. I would say from my experience, when you're looking at a small company, it depends on the direct, like what phase you're at. Are you creating your first prototype, your second prototype, your third prototype? It also depends on the testing you have to do. So I'm not necessarily advocating that you design a product which passes testing, but to a certain extent, you shouldn't make the product so complicated such that your characterization testing turns into a PhD dissertation in and of itself. And I think, with startups, when you're just trying to make a prototype and show that it works, right? Again, thinking about it from a company perspective, you do have to have to a certain extent, start thinking about, okay, is this going to be easy for me to manufacture, even as a startup company? Am I looking at a cost that is just completely astronomical? That does start coming into account, and the sooner that you can bring that into your thought process during product development, the better that you're going to be. Now, the problem becomes when you're trying to scale it up to a Medtronic or a Boston or an Abbott. That's not a realistic goal. That's not why strategics, invest dollars in startups, right? But you do have to start thinking about, how do you explain why you did certain things, why you picked certain things? And you should be able to explain, well, it'll take a little while, and it'll require these specific manufacturing process changes to get to, this level. You need to be able to articulate that pretty well. But I will say, when it comes to like cost, you can get it down to a penny, and strategic's going to say, why can't you get it less than that? So, you just have to manage, what your team is capable of doing, as well as the need for having the kind of velocity that's expected for a startup. And like, it's a very broad thing, but that pretty much assumes that you've got folks on your team that know how to make trade-offs really well. And you don't, a lot of people think that you need to have folks with domain expertise in medical devices to do that. I don't necessarily believe that. You just need people who are pragmatic and can critically think through a problem. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still COGS, right? Cost of goods and services, and it's still finance. And so you have to be able to balance that and have the right team to make good decisions of what gets put down for later and what needs to happen right now. So there's no really straight answer when it comes to manufacturing. My only guidance is, don't make it so overly artful that, if you're going from 5 pieces to 20, which, it doesn't sound like a lot, but once you start having to increase the number of devices that you make, it becomes more complicated. You're looking at, wild variations in product performance.
So if you're new to the space and you're an innovator and you have this great invention, or at least extremely early stage idea, and you're at the point where most of the research to market or I-Core teams are, where they're trying to figure out if they are actually solving a real need, or if it's still fairly academic. If you don't, how do you find those people to put on your team, right? Like in pharma, we would go to a CRO, and you vet your CROs and you hope you find a team that you really like, a clinical research organization, for those in the audience who don't know what a CRO is. And they help you, especially when you're to the clinical trial stage. But this is well before then. This is right in figuring out if you can even plan to get to the clinical trial stage. How do you find those individuals, those mentors, partners?
It's actually a little unfair for me to talk about it since I'm in the industry. So a lot of, who we hire is word of mouth. I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy. And if you're outside of this domain space, I think, especially if you're one of the founders, getting smart about what you're building is super important, because a mechanical engineer is a mechanical engineer is a mechanical engineer, right? So what you really have to find is someone who, for example, if you're building a catheter, you need a materials engineer, right? And you also need a mechanical engineer. That's really, at the end of the day, all you really need. You should expect engineers to learn a new domain space pretty quickly. But if you don't understand who you need to hire and the types of people that you need to hire, it doesn't matter if you're already in med tech, you're going to make bad hiring decisions. So, as a founder of a company, the smarter you can get about what you think your idea is going to be, that helps narrow the scope as it relates to hires. Especially the doers of the organization. And at the end of the day, I think it's just someone who, works hard and works well in a team. But I will say, even for myself, I've moved from, cardiovascular to, the neuromodulation space or the autoimmune space. And I have to learn a whole new set of, just doctors, different different aspects of how the product works. I mean, I've worked with devices that require electromagnetic safety and compatibility testing before, but not to the scale. And so to a certain extent, to the folks who think like, oh, I have to find like a med tech person, not necessarily. Even med tech people have to learn new things when they go to different companies. But, if you're not in this space, getting smart about what you're building is really important. And, finding organizations like CSU and CU and Innosphere Ventures who can help you network. And, quite frankly, even with our organization and getting to know new KOLs, sometimes you dial, right?
Mm-hmm.
My boss calls it dial for dollars, when we're doing site selection, but, it's still the same concept, right? It's a lot of cold calls and cold emails and being persistent. And you'll find someone who can, knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy.
Have you ever, well, I'm sure the answer to this is yes, but can you tell me about what some of the surprises are that often feel like surprises to founders or inventors that maybe should not be
Mhm.
surprises if they've really done their due diligence. But again, right, if you don't know what questions to ask, you're always going to be surprised. So there's a level of learning that has to happen before you even know what to ask. So just for the audience and the innovators in it, like things you should be aware
I
of.
think what most people are surprised about, at least from my experience, is how much the agency influences this process. So, people think, well, it's just a regulatory process. No, it's called a scientific review process for a reason. And even to a certain extent, the agency wants to know, are you making something that needs to be fixed? They call it clinical utility. And they love asking this question: what is the clinical utility of your product? So I think a lot of people get surprised when the agency starts asking that question. I think I've even had a couple of companies that I've helped out that are like, why do they care? And I'm like, because they care about the products that get on the market. Now they can't keep you from getting on the market, but it can become very painful if you don't have a clinical utility for your product, or if you don't know what it is. Because if you don't know what the clinical utility of the product is, then they start asking, do you know what you're doing? So, don't underestimate the influence that regulators have in this process. It is huge. I think one of the R2M companies was surprised at the amount of biocompatibility testing you have to do. I can tell you the number of tests is not what you should be surprised at. It's how much it actually costs. And a lot of that, again, is still driven by, what the FDA or notified body or Japan expects to see when they're evaluating safety and effectiveness for a product. So I think that's why when I worked for Philips, the last job I had there was working with a group called Advanced Development, where we did a multifaceted approach when it came to market development. So we answered all of those 5 questions before a project could move forward. And if the regulatory pathway was going to be too painful, it could be the reason why a project gets axed. Or if, the revenue projections or what you think you're going to get out of the project isn't there, that could be it as well. It's not just simply whether or not you can make the product work.
So since you have mentioned those 5 buckets again, I'm going to have you restate them in case anybody was taking notes and did not get all 5 of them and or they want them again. So I know the first one is need.
Yep. You're solving a problem that needs to be solved.
Yes.
Can you make the solution? Does your solution work? Can you make money off of your solution? And what does it take to get it approved or on the market? And by the way, that can be many different things. It's not just regulatory. It could also be you need to do some clinical development. Perhaps it's a space where your specialty or your surgeon or your interventionalist, they're like, I don't know how this works. Sounds like a great idea. You may have to do a little bit of clinical development work just to even get your customers to buy into the idea or even be interested in using it.
So that's a really, we spend a lot of time on that in R2M, the difference between identifying a customer and in medical devices, especially when you're talking about surgical devices. We tend to confuse the person that it ends up being implanted in as the user, when in fact it's not necessarily. It's often the surgeon who is doing the implanting or using that medical device. How, in your experience, how have you sort of gone through those different types of customers and worked with surgeons or those who will actually implement the use of the device to get them to respond to your questions, to help you figure out if they do really have a need for it, or there's something lacking, or what the characteristics should be.
Yep.
And getting access to them. Right now in COVID, it's very hard to get access to the medical profession.
It's hard for us as well. So if you're running a clinical trial, it gets a little painful once you get a surge. But I mean, in my experience, again, like I said, it's a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy. If I wasn't in this particular field, I would go to, the big research institutions, in your locality, right? So ours is all up in Denver. So, you go to UC, right? Or you go into the system and talk to folks that are local. I would not start off with, national or global. One of the things that you have to watch out for is that, people want to get paid for their time, and fair market value for doctors is pretty high. So if there's someone in our own academic or system that can help support that we can introduce people to, I think those are really good places to start. And it's not because, physicians or surgeons are greedy. It's just they get, especially when you're talking about true KOLs, they get asked these questions a lot. And so, so they can continue practicing medicine. They usually, want to make sure that it's worth their time. But that's what I would recommend that you do. And really don't just stop with the surgeons, right? You would be surprised of how many people in the OR are also your customers, right? The techs, the nurses. And right now the agency has a pretty big push on, patient preference. I think the patient is still super important to get that type of feedback. But, I would recommend that, trying to find your network locally before you start, perusing literature and, figuring out, like, the second author in this clinical trial is the PI. So let me go email this dude, and he's in Cedars-Sinai in LA. Because usually if you can start local, if it's an expert at children's, they're going to know people in other parts of the country that you can organically start getting introduced to, right? So I think that would be my recommendation if you're looking at trying to get access to customers that are otherwise very difficult to get a hold of.
Have you worked on anything? I'm thinking while you're talking and absorbing the information, and it's so interesting to me, and ties so much to what we do try to teach in research to market and the NIH and NSF ICOR programs that are nationally available to really help make innovation in academia functional and possible. And I'm curious if you have an example or a story of just sort of a crazy mistake that was made or happened that you only realized afterwards and think would be of benefit to share.
Oh, crazy mistake. So this is sort of a lesson from working for a startup, right? So startup companies are stereotypically thought of as being very aggressive. They think outside of the box, all of these catchphrases. But the one thing you have to keep in mind is you still have to get the product on the market. So there are boundary conditions to how creative you are and how aggressive you can be. And I think one example was, we we had a process change at one of our vendors that, we needed to get through now, because we had products being made with this new component and it needed to get into the clinical study. And I decided to take probably an approach that I would have never taken. It's very, very aggressive, very minimal testing. And I somehow convinced myself that my R&D teammate at the time, sold me on it. Even though in the back of my head, I'm like, oh, should probably have some backup testing started in parallel. Which we didn't. We didn't. Suffice it to say, and when you're running a clinical trial, this is a big deal. By not taking those things into consideration, by not having backup testing going in parallel, we had a 3-month delay in the clinical trial, 3-month delay in which we could control. And that's not okay. Right? If you have a 3-month delay because of whatever reason outside of your control, that's an easy explanation to your board of directors. But when it is something that is within your control, shame on me for not catching that sooner. Now, I had a very amazing clinical colleague who was able to compensate for that 3-month delay and figure out other things that we could do to accelerate the program. But, it took 3 months, because it took 3 months to get the testing done. So my recommendation would be, especially since the general expectation is that startups are more creative and more aggressive, you still have to know where your risks are and you still have to mitigate them. So if you got to spend $60,000 on testing, but you don't want to do it right now and you want to see if FDA is willing to accept a rationale, you should start the $60,000 worth of testing as soon as possible, just in case if the agency, disagrees. And we had a pretty good rationale, but still the answer was nope, you have to do all the testing. So, that would be something that I would recommend to folks, that, there's no lower bar at any regulatory body just because you're a startup. The bar is the bar is the bar is the bar. Unfortunately, larger companies can meet them very easily. And, when you're looking at in animal studies costing $500,000 because they have to be GLP, and you're a startup company, and it's a pretty tough pill to swallow. But unfortunately, there is no lower bar for a startup company, whether you're looking at building out a quality system, whether you're looking at running a clinical study, engineering testing. There's one bar and everybody has to meet it. You can be creative on how you meet it, but nonetheless, you have to meet it.
Is there ever a time that is too early to request involvement or advice from someone at the FDA?
No. So like I said, the project that we had to put down, we didn't even have a prototype built. We just had an idea. Now, we were transparent about what we were doing, right? We told them like, hey, we have this process at our company. Part of that involves the regulatory body, come and play with us and see how this works out for everybody. It worked out really well. I mean, the agency did a great job of helping us design a clinical trial that was, meaningful for both the company and them. Unfortunately, just the dollars didn't make any sense, but there's never a too early to talk to them about it. They have these things called informational meetings in medical devices where, you probably won't get feedback, but you can tell them what your idea is and you can walk them through your prototype. You can even walk them through your product development process, to let them know, when your next talking point is going to be. But the agency loves hearing about stuff early and often. And that's my plug for the FDA.
I was going to ask, is there for anybody who's new to device development or even pharma development, is there a preferred method of reaching out to the agency, or is it all just found on the website and you sort of go in and you just start inquiring?
There are groups within the agency that work with small businesses. I actually know the director for the ones for medical devices, and they're more than happy to reach out and, you know, help you figure out all of the different processes and methods of getting feedback. You don't need to pay a regulatory expert to do that. They're more than happy to. It's just you have to go to, I could probably send that to you for devices. The agency is far more helpful than people give them credit for. The only thing they can't do is tell you how to think and how to do stuff, but they can definitely help you navigate their regulatory processes and get you into contact with the right people with the agency or at the agency to get your, you know, get your product reviewed. So I can definitely share that with you guys, the group at least the med device group that works with small businesses. And I think CEDAR also, the drug and the biologics group also has a small business group. Although I think drug companies or small businesses are pretty big, but yeah, they definitely have resources for startup companies. And I think with, you know, with the advent of the medical device regulations in Europe, you know, the FDA is really pushing to, you know, be at the forefront of innovation and really help, you know, early stage companies get through the process.
In all of your experience over the years, do you see the industry? It used to be that we had many more smaller companies that all had their niche. And now we have a lot of very large companies that buy the smaller companies and sort of absorb the niches. Do you see that as is that sort of becoming the direction of startups in medical device arenas, or in pharma? It's very prevalent, or more prevalent to me in pharma, but where a startup company can become their own company and become actually their own powerhouse to build their content? Or is the trend really being that you get the device manufactured to a certain point and your likelihood of being purchased is the real true advantageous exit strategy?
So I think, and my boss, Heather Simonson, actually taught me this, like what gets you acquired or what gets you through an IPO are actually the same things. Building out a company. Like I mentioned, if you're short-sighted, if you're only about the exit, you're going to get beat out by a lot of other startups who think from that perspective. They think that they're going to have to do an IPO. And if you look at yourself from that perspective, that we are trying to build a company and we are ready to launch this thing if we have to do it, you know, you're doing all of the right things that bring value to an organization. And I actually think the medical device industry is going away from buying things at very early stages, right? Boston Scientific, Medtronic, they don't want to incur anything on their books until they absolutely have to. They also don't want to have to deal with the risk or bring in something that needs a certain amount of velocity into, you know, their business processes and quality systems, which are very different once you're having to answer to Wall Street versus just a VC, a private equity firm, or another strategic who's investing in your company. So, you know, they recognize the value that startups have. Do I think that, you know, we're going in that direction for pharma? I mean, I think so. You know, you throw a rock over to Silicon Valley, and you could probably find a large number of startups working on transcatheter mitral valves, or the next best, drug coated something or other. The question becomes, are you going to rise above everybody else? And I think from what I've seen, the companies that are very successful at either an exit through acquisition or an IPO are companies that take the part about building a company seriously. And my boss and my former CEO, Rich Ferrari, did that for the last startup that I worked for, PQ Bypass. And, I think it was something crazy. Like, I think in 24 quarters, we didn't miss a milestone, which is unheard of. I can't remember what the number was. My boss did the numbers a couple of months ago, but if you function that way, and if you think that way, it doesn't matter if you get acquired or if you have to do an IPO. You're doing everything you need to do to bring value to an organization. So even if at the end of the day you want to get acquired, be prepared, do the work that needs to be done to build out a company. I think that you learn a lot more about how the industry works, because getting ready for a commercial launch is its own monstrous activity, regardless if you're a class 2 or a class 3 medical device, versus the early stages. And it really helps you understand what these larger companies are really looking for.
So audience, nobody's put anything in the Q&A, and you don't have to, but if I haven't covered something that you're really interested in knowing, please feel free to jump in. We have about 7 minutes left before Pharoah heads back to her day job. Pharoah, for you, I'm curious, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to share with the audience, or that you think is really inspirational or insightful?
I think my most recent experience into startup companies has been pretty amazing. I mean, I work for one of my former bosses, and the VC that we're involved in, as well as the incubator that's supporting us, is an amazing group of folks. Fogarty Innovation is very well known in Silicon Valley. Andrew Cleland is a very successful business leader. He sold a couple of pretty successful companies to Medtronic, but the support system they have is amazing. And the VC that we work with, Arboretum Ventures, is also amazing. And the one thing I will say is that you do have a choice when you're out there looking for investors. You have a choice of who you want to take money from. And I would say be smart about it, because they get to dictate how your company runs in the long term. So, you want people that believe not only in your idea, but they also believe in supporting you as an organization. So I've had a really positive experience, in the last 2 weeks, just being a part of this ecosystem. And, if you're a founder looking for support, monetary support, be very picky about the ecosystem that you have, because it definitely can influence the trajectory of your organization.
So Nico put in a question. Good, thank you, Nico. Pharoah and I were talking about whether or not you would ask a question earlier. So
right.
He has two. He has recommendations on where to find literature specifically regarding developing medical devices, and or for clinical trials, and how to approach them strategically.
So literature on how to develop medical devices. I mean, besides just PubMed, which is where we all go, there are a lot of actually very clever resources where you can get literature behind a firewall for free. I'm happy to share where that is to folks. But, typically, if it's a new space, I think a lot of people start off with, the high level reviews of, either the disease state or the types of products you're looking at, and then go from there, narrowing your scope and figuring out, who are the thought leaders in that particular space. But that's what I would recommend. Now, realistically, people don't, it's not a very good practice, but it should be. People don't publish when things go wrong with their own products. Other people do. I would definitely look at, the FDA mod database to figure out, what are the shortcomings of some of the products that are on the market today. You'll see a very long list of, I wouldn't say, device malfunctions, sometimes device failures that you would typically see for any type of product that you're working on, or general category of product. That would probably be my recommendation. And then, clinical trials as it relates to the literature. So a lot of it, you can get a pretty good idea of what your endpoint should be for those types of studies. Is it a 12-month endpoint? Is it a 6-month endpoint? Also gets a pretty good idea of, the types of diagnostic tools that you have to use throughout the course of the study. The other is a really good source, especially for class 3 medical devices. It's on FDA's website. It's called a PMA SSED, Summary of Safety and Effectiveness Description. Is the description or discussion? I think the D is discussion. But either way, what that document does is it tells you what it took to get a product on the market, including the clinical trial design. So I would not go with studies that are less than 5, or products that are less than 5 years old to get what the agency thinks of today from a clinical trial design standpoint. So if you're looking at an SSED from 2002, it's a good benchmark, but you should probably get something pretty contemporary to get an idea of what and the types of trials that the FDA look at for getting a product on the market. And other thing too, guys, clinical trials are not limited to class 3 medical devices. A clinical trial is just a form of design validation, which means it can also be used for class 2 devices. So if you are playing in the class 2 realm, I would double check whether or not your product requires clinical data to get 510(k) cleared. Wouldn't assume just because it's class 2 that FDA doesn't ask you for some clinical data.
Thank you. We have just a quick moment left, but so that everybody knows, you can see that Pharoah put her email as her name today. So I'm going to assume that means if you have a question for her back channel, that you can feel free to use her email and reach out to her. For those of you who want to ask additional questions that may come to you as you progress through your innovations. And then Linda asked the best advice to protect the novel ideas through the long development process and the many touch points with external groups and people. And I can say just at the front end of that from an academic perspective, you should be reaching out to your tech transfer office, whether at CU Boulder or Anschutz or at CSU, and working with them to make sure that they either can put patents in place or get provisional patents in place as you get started, especially for university-owned intellectual property. And Pharoah, I'll let you answer the rest of that question for.
Oh, absolutely. Any way that you can protect your IP, whether it's through a university system, we pay very expensive lawyers to do that. That is also, throughout the product development process, you come up with new ideas that maybe you need to put on the shelf, or new ideas that you need to implement now, but you need to protect. So the sooner that you can do that, That's super important. And it's also super important in diligence as well. You know, that you've got IP around your technology, not only just your design, but sometimes there is IP for processes as well. So
awesome. Well, thank you. We are out of time. We ran all the way up to 1 o'clock. So you all were amazing. Thank you so much to the audience, and thank you, Pharoah. You made it through my questions like a champ. So
thanks.
I really appreciate it, and many thanks to the CCTSI and the REACH program, Spark REACH program for funding this. We very much appreciate it, and we hope to see all of you again in another month for the next one. So again, reach out to Pharoah directly if anybody has any follow-up questions. We appreciate it.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all. Bye.